Chapter 6: The Black Books and the Red Book. Lessons from Carl Jung's Unconscious. Jung argued that the ultimate goal of the process of individuation was the development and exploration of the self. As discussed, the self, according to Jung, consists of the entirety of an individual's personality. The combination of the conscious personality, the ego, and the unconscious personality. In order to reach this goal, a certain communication between the conscious and unconscious would be necessary. For this purpose, Jung proposed the engagement of certain inner dialogues through active imagination. Jung believed that every individual is capable of holding these inner dialogues. This is also how Jung wrote the Black Books, which represent, in essence, a dialogue between Jung's conscious and unconscious. In this chapter, Jung's own exploration of the self is discussed based on Jung's documentation of this exploration throughout the Red Book and the Black Books. Although this book has already referred to this exploration on multiple occasions, this chapter is dedicated entirely to Jung's initial fantasies and dreams. As indicated in the introduction, such a discussion was not possible before the publication of the Red Book and the Black Books, since Jung kept these initial fantasies largely to himself. Through the discoveries which Jung made about his own self, we can also learn a lot about our own unique self. Moreover, as mentioned in the introduction as well, the content discussed throughout this chapter turned out to be the source of Jung's most important theories and concepts. It therefore provides interesting insights into the mind of one's greatest thinkers of the 20th century. As you will see, most of the content discussed in this book so far returns in a more unrefined manner throughout this chapter. Thereby, it is the aim of this chapter is to illustrate why this content formed the basis of Jung's ideas and indicate how the contents presented to Jung by this unconscious might also be interest to us. My soul, where are you? As discussed in the previous chapter, the exploration of the unconscious is not an easy endeavor. This applied even to Jung. At the beginning of the second volume of the Black Books, Jung wrote the following: "A huge task lay before me. I saw this enormous size, and its value and meaning escaped me. I got into the dark, and I groped along my path. The path led inwards and downwards." I believe that for Jung, this huge task was not just the exploration of his own unconscious, but also a correct documentation of this exploration, which he could share with the world. As mentioned previously, Jung made it his mission to plant his discoveries into the soil of reality. In the beginning of the second volume of the Black Books, Jung attempted to address his soul, indicating that they have long been separated from one another. "I have returned, here I am again. I have shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I have come to you again. I am with you after long years of wandering. The one thing I have learned is that one must live this life. This life is the way, the long shout after way to the unfathomable, which we call divine." According to Jung, all other ways are false, indicating that the right way cannot be found in other people, other things, or other religion, but only within the individual. Jung himself indicated that he became separated from his soul because he did not see that the only right way could be found within himself. Instead, Jung observed that he had been paying too much attention to the external world and therefore essentially belonged to the external world. Jung wondered like this until he started to pay attention to the image which he believed his soul presented to him in his dream. He wondered how his soul managed to survive without him paying any attention to his soul for so long. However, he concluded that his soul was, despite inattention, always present and was guiding him along this way, albeit in the invisible manner. Therefore, as you can see early in the process of writing the Black Books, Jung was eager to start his journey to self-discovery. However, Jung faced several difficulties in understanding what his soul tried to communicate to him. He can see, however, that a main theme at the beginning of the Black Books consists of the idea that the soul cannot be found in things outside of the self, such as other people or other objects. Instead, it must be found within. When one fully submits oneself to the outer material world, one will be moving away from one's soul. In order to then return to one's soul, one must return to oneself. The spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. I believe that this would later form the inspiration of Jung's idea of the spirit of the time and the spirit of the depths. As mentioned in the previous chapter, according to Jung, there exists two dimensions. One, the spirit of the time, and two, the spirit of the depths. The spirit of the time is always changing and represent consciousness, whereas the spirit of the depths is everlasting and represent the unconscious. In essence, I believe that for Jung, the spirit for the depths represented the following. If one wants to find one's soul, one should dig very deep. One should not just consider one's own life as it is in this time, but everything that has ever happened before. One should not try to judge or objectify one's soul. One should not consider it in terms of good or evil. Moreover, one should not even think that one is equal to one's soul, or that one can control one's soul. I had to speak to my soul as to something far off and unknown, which did not exist through me, but through whom I existed. In this sense, it might be argued that our soul has always existed and will always exist. The only thing that may change is one's awareness of one's soul. An individual can find his or her soul by looking inwards. Here, Jung and the Buddha appear to agree. He whose desire turns away from other things reaches the place of the soul. However, if one is not successful in this endeavor, a blind pursuit of meaningless material object might be the result. If he does not find the soul, the horror of emptiness will overcome him, and fear will drive him with a whip, lashing time and again, in a desperate endeavor and a blind desire for the hollow things of the world. As Jung timelessly stressed, as individual can never find the soul in external thing. Instead, the soul can only be found within. He becomes a soul through his endless desire and forget the way of his soul, never to find her again. He will run after all things and will seize hold of them, but he will not find his soul, since he would find her only in himself. As such, when an individual is trying to find his or her soul, he or she should look inward. One should try not to judge or objectify what one finds, and one should not try to label it. It appears, Jung argued, that one should interact with one's soul and let the soul interact with oneself, as if one were interacting with another person. For this present discussion, it is important to note that the soul speaks the language of spirit, of the depths. The exploration of these depths terrified Jung initially. What torture! I must return to myself, to my smallest things. I want to be careful and say, I had learned to see other things as large and had compared those with the things of my soul and had discovered that they were small. You force me to see them as large to make them large. Is that your aim? I follow, but it terrifies me. As a consequence of this fear, Jung had a hard time trusting his soul. Jung found strange because he could easily trust other people. Then why could he not trust his own soul? As a result of this paradox, Jung became convicted that he had to trust his soul completely. Jung wrote this decision down in the black books. Your hand lies heavy on me, but I am willing. Have I got rendered my best to love men and trust them? And soul, I not render this to you, my own soul, or rather the soul by which I am owned. Yes, I see how you guide me. I recognize your wise schooling. You convince me, and I follow. The way of the soul. After this decision to completely trust and follow his soul, Jung began his adventure into the depths of his own unconscious. Although it is a rather personal journey, it becomes clear from the beginning that it is very relatable, and in this sense as well, we can understand clearly why Jung become convinced of the existence of some sort of collective unconscious. The beginnings of the Jung's adventure do not go all too smoothly. After reading the Red Book, one might get the impression that Jung had a certain natural talent of the effortless exploration of the unconscious, which he probably had anyway, however, thought out the first parts of the black books. The reader can observe that Jung had to overcome several challenges. Jung later elaborated on these challenges throughout the Red Book. Some of these were discussed in the previous chapters as the temptations which one must overcome. The first obstacle Jung had to overcome during his process came from the realization that his soul was a desert, and where Jung thought he would find true meaning. Jung was met with emptiness. My soul leads me into the desert of my own self. I did not think that my soul is the desert, and yet it seems to be the case. The journey leads through hot sand, slowly wading without a visible goal to hope for. Previously, I had already indicated that if we turn our attention inwards, Jung observed that we might find that the world of our soul is a desert. It is up to us too, by directing our creative energies inwards, fertilize the land of the soul. Moreover, besides directing his attention inwards as opposed to outwards, Jung became convinced that he had to rise above his own thoughts. Jung believed that this was the case because his own thoughts were also preventing him from finding the place of his soul. I was my thoughts after I was no longer events and other men, but I was not myself. Confronted with my thoughts, I was still in my thoughts, where I should even rise up above my thoughts to my own self, the place of my soul, and this myself is a desert, unwanted and untended. Some of these thoughts which Jung believed he had to forego were the intention which he had set for himself before his exploration of the unconscious. As I indicated previously as well, Jung believed that we should be careful to not limit ourselves too much by setting intentions, a thought which Jung explored throughout the second volume of Black Books. According to Jung, we cannot in advance now, through our intentions or thought, from where true inspiration will come. Jung believed that the desert of his own soul, which he had to cross, and the fear which accompanied him were a necessary part of the journey, whereby his rational thoughts could not offer any assistance. However, despite his own encouragement, Jung continued to struggle with his journey initially. For example, Jung noted that many of the situations indicating the figure which he encountered were a lot less meaningful than he had hoped. Jung even compared the stories which he experienced to certain types of novel and fairy tales which he hated since he was young. Therefore, Jung started to wonder whether the contents of his soul could provide him with any meaning at all. However, close to the end of the second volume, in a dialogue with his unconscious, it is indicated that the stories and the novel which Jung loathed, including Age of Fairy Tales, might be closer to the truth than expected. Be reasonable, dear friend, and do not stumble now over the fabulous, since the fairy tale is the ancestors of the novel and has even more universal validity than the most avidly read novel of your time, and you know that what has been on everyone's lips for millennia, through repeated endlessly, still comes nearest and ultimate human truth. So do not let the fabulous come between us. This conclusion corresponds to the argument made by Joseph Campbell, who, as we have seen in chapter 4, also argued that the symbolic meaning of myths hide a symbolic truth. As a result, Jung concluded that the contents presented by his soul were far from meaningless. I believe that hereafter Jung becomes increasingly interested in myths, fairy tales, and all other kinds of folklore. Jung's new perspective regarding these fairy tales and other stories marks an important shift in Jung's thoughts. Throughout the first part of the Black Books, Jung illustrated the challenge which he had to face during the initial stage of the exploration of his own soul. Although Jung continually assured himself that he must trust his soul and the places to which his soul is taking him, he continued to remain doubtful because he is faced with emptiness and lack of meanings. The stories which his soul presented to him remain superficial and are not the idea which he expected his soul would be representing him. However, as Jung indicated as well, his experimentation and intentions were that was limiting him. After this conclusion, we see Jung make a clear move away from knowledge and reason, replaced by a direction towards mystic, i.e., the spirit of death. This transition was not easy to make for Jung, and we can clearly see his struggle with the realization that such a transition was required of him. But does our knowledge also not hold good for you? What is going to be? If not knowledge, where is security? Where is ground? Where is firm land? Where is light? As a result, for a long time, after rejecting the security of the spirit of time, Jung was searching for a new sort of security, ground, land, and light. Jung came to the realization that his soul, besides residing in a different world, also has her own will, and that there was nothing which Jung had to teach to his soul. Jung realized that his soul knew her own way best. As a result of his realization, Jung had to forego on the scientific truth upon which he had relied heavily upon until that point. I feel that a large chunk of science has been broken off. I suppose it might be like this for the sake of the soul and her life. Jung worried that no one would benefit from this unscientific research which he was conducting. At the same time, Jung realized that this was what was required of him. I find the thought that this must occur only for me agonizing, and that perhaps no one will gain insight from my work. But my soul demands this achievement. Interestingly, however, as already mentioned frequently in this book, all of Jung's most important and influential idea, which we widely known today, sprung from his own scientific research of the way of soul. Is the war Gilgamesh the giant? Despite this agonizing thought that no one would benefit from his work, Jung continued his adventure. Jung compared himself to early Christian anchorites who withdrew from society for the sake of a certain calling, leaving the material world behind. Jung ventured into his own desert and realized how dark it was. How dark is the path of a man when he reaches the new world, the world in between, beyond us. There is unending darkness. Where is this beyond? Probably deep in ourselves. However, eventually, by opening up to his unconscious, Jung started to encounter certain interesting characters through his exploration. One of these characters is Isdvar, an ancient Mesopotamian mythological figure who is now best known as Gilgamesh. This interaction clearly illustrates the distance between the world of the conscious and the unconscious. At the beginning of this interaction, Isdvar is struck by the horrific scientific truths Jung shared with him. According to Isdvar, these truths are poisonous. However, Jung indicates that these poisonous truths are what we consider to be science. O Isdvar, most powerful one, what you call poison is science. In our country, we are nurtured on it from youth, and that may be one reason why we haven't properly flourished and remain so dwarfish. When I see you, however, it seems to me as if we are all somewhat poisoned. These truths directly contradicts the truths which Isdvar had heard from the priests of his world, and Isdvar argues that the truth of his priests are, as opposed to Jung's scientific truth, not poisonous. After discussing back and forth, they conclude that there must be two kinds of truth, one coming from the observation of external world and another one stemming from the exploration of the inner world. Our truth is that which comes to us from the knowledge of outer things. The truth of your priest is that which comes to you from inner thing of the human spirit. I believe that this interaction was part of the inspiration for Jung's ideas of the spirit of the time and the spirit of the death as well. Meanwhile, however, the poisonous truth of the external world have been so horrific to Isdvar that is severely lamed by them. Jung concludes that we human have no choice but to accept the truth of external world. If we do not do so, they might eventually overwhelm us as well, and we ourselves will equally lamed. Now you have perhaps see that we had no choice. We have to swallow the poison of science, otherwise we meet the same fate as you have. We will be completely lamed if we encountered in unsuspecting and unprepared. This poison is so unsurmountably strong that everyone, even the strongest and even the eternal God, perish because of it. The conversation below between Jung and Isdvar illustrates this idea further. Isdvar, have you no guts anymore? Jung, no, words are all we have left. Isdvar, but are these words powerful? Jung, so they claim, but one notices nothing of it. Isdvar, we do not see the gods either, and yet we believe that they exist, and we recognize their working in natural events. Jung, science has taken from us the capacity to believe. Isdvar, what? You have lost that too. How then do you live? Jung, we live so, with one foot in the hot and one foot in the cold, and for the rest, come what may. Isdvar, you express yourself darkly. Jung, so it also is with us. It is dark. Isdvar, can you bear it? Look where you least want to look. In relation to this discussion, Jung made an interesting remark. According to Jung, the scientific truths poisonous to the figure of Isdvar can be problematic to us as well. This is the case because the possibility of our conscious world have become limitless, and we risk being swallowed up by the immense variety of possibilities. As a result, Jung indicated that no one will be able to grasp the entire path of life any younger, and only specialists will be able to exist. Instead of this specialization, Jung suggested that we need to overarching principle, something which is capable to offer guidance to the mind, which such a time of limitless possibilities, our time requires something capable of regulating the mind. More than ever, we require the living truth of the life of the mind, of something capable of providing form guidance. Friedrich Nietzsche, in this book, The Gay Science, made a similar argument. We have given things a new color. We go on painting them continually. But what do all our efforts to date available when we hold them against the colored splendor of what old master, anciently humanity? Here we can see that Jung was hinting to the development of some sort of new myth for our modern age, as discussed at the beginning of this book with the argument of Joseph Campbell. Such a myth might be based on the greatest mystery existing at present, man himself. One of the aspects of life for which our mind requires guidance, according to Jung, is the existence of evil. Science has not yet proven a match against the existence of evil. Perhaps it was even be argued that science has, in several ways, insulted in only more evil. Here, an overarching principle might be essential. Jung himself observed that he had been paying too little attention to evil as well, even though it is an equally important aspect of life. I believe that this discussion of evil was the source for one of Jung's most profound ideas, finding that which one needs the most at the places where one least wants to look, where lies an inner reluctance. What is it I do not want to see? With this idea in mind, Jung decided to venture into this valley of which he was so afraid. In this valley, he finds a dead girl who is missing her head. Suddenly, another figure appears within this imagination of Jung, who addresses him and wants to know that Jung makes of this sight an interesting conversation ensues. She asks me quickly, "What then do you say?" Jung, "What should I say? This is beyond words." She, "Do you understand this?" Jung, "I refuse to understand such things. I can't speak about them without becoming enraged." She, "Why become enraged? You might as well rage every day of your life, for this and similar things occur on earth every day. Eventually, the figure asks Jung to take out the liver of the dead girl's body and eat it. Jung, of course, refuses, but the figure claims to be the soul of the dead child and argues that Jung must eat the liver in order to help her. After committing the act, the figure reveals herself and indicates to Jung that she is his soul. Do you recognize me, Jung? How strangely familiar you are. Who are you? See, I am your soul. This was Jung's first true encounter with his soul. Jung managed to reach this point by 1. Letting go of his reliance on scientific truths, and 2. By looking at the places where at least wanted to look. These interactions continue throughout the black books, and it becomes clear that Jung gradually becomes more comfortable and confident during these interactions. Jung appeared a lot less afraid of the characters and is capable to engage in some interesting discussion with these characters. Nietzsche's truth. Another such interesting interaction occurred between Jung and librarian and relates to the idea of Friedrich Nietzsche. The librarian argues that although religions have lost their importance to a significant degree, authors such as Nietzsche have been able to fill the void by writing their own books of prayer. In the case of Nietzsche, this was thus spoke Zarathustra. As discussed in the introduction, Jung argued that Nietzsche's philosophy can only fill this void for a select group of individuals, those that are too constrained and require more freedom and independence. Another group of people, those that are perhaps too free, require a different philosophy, according to Jung, one that provides them with certain boundaries and resignation. I believe that Jung, throughout his work, explored such a truth intensively, whereas Nietzsche's philosophy was aimed at making humans feel more superior and at motivating them to remove all chains, including those from societies and religions. Jung was in some ways developing a philosophy which addresses the inferiority of men. This inferiority resulted from men being under a strong influence of the unconscious force of the soul. At the same time, however, one was aware of this inferiority. It could be empowering as well. One example found in the Black Books is the recognition of madness. Jung believed that everyone is filled with madness to come to some degree, and the sooner one recognizes this, the better. Instead of hiding one's madness and fearing that it might be hiding, Jung suggested us to embrace madness and let it live its own life. Moreover, according to Jung, neglecting madness and only striving towards reason is often useless and in part merely done in order to feel less inferior and impose certain rule upon life. However, as Jung argued, life itself lacks any rules, and the reliance on such rules is merely an attempt at making life comprehensible. However, a pair of life itself is inherently incomprehensible. It cannot be made comprehensible. Instead, it must be embraced. In this sense, I believe that Jung managed to create a philosophy which was a great addition of the philosophy of Nietzsche. Wherever Nietzsche empowered men by indicating in which ways human can be powerful and independent, Jung indicated in which says humans can be vulnerable and powerless. The Black Books are an important source of this philosophy. In a similar way, according to Jung, we should not try to find meaning and truth all the time. Instead, we should just live the truth. We create the truth by living it. Only introspective life becomes truth. We do not find truth first and then we live it, but the other way around. Equally, we should embrace all aspects of life and respect that one aspect cannot be without the other. Life should proceed from birth to death and from death to birth. from sense to madness, and from madness to sense, unbroken like a path of the sun. Everything should proceed on this path. It is also interesting to note that while Jung was having this interaction with his own unconscious, which might seem like a sort of madness, Jung was purposely trying to live a normal life. By doing so, Jung managed to keep a foot in the real world. After several interactions, Jung's soul asked him whether he was willing to accept everything which she would give him, as Jung affirmed throughout the other volumes as well. He became more than willing to do so and was open to everything. I will gratefully accept what you give, my soul. I do not have the right to judge or reject. Fate will separate the wheat from the chaff. We have to subjugate ourselves also to the judgment of valuelessness and destruction in majorem vita gloriam, to the greater glory of life. Eventually, Jung believed that he had accomplished quite a lot through his interaction with figure of unconscious. His soul, however, pointed out to him that he still had a long way to go. It seems to me as if I look back as into a work that has been accomplished. Shall I look back yet? How curious you are. Nothing is accomplished yet. What do you mean, not accomplished? This is only the beginning. Carl Jung's uncertainty and the Shepherd. Despite encouraging a philosophy of humility and resignation, Jung continued to worry about the potential meaninglessness of his own endeavor. In an interaction with his unconscious, it was pointed out to him that everyone has the possibility to discover what was taking place in his or her unconscious, but that this might be a too demanding task for most, and that the price one has to pay might be too high. Jung himself therefore worried whether the price that he was paying would be worth it. The uncertainty and unpredictability are different to bear, naturally, but who says it is the easy load to carry? If one wants to create the future and not just live it. This uncertainty is, however, inevitable, as observed by Jung, since the true value of any undertaking will only reveal itself after the task has been completed. At the end of the 4th volume of the Black Book, Jung shared another interesting interaction, this time with a shepherd. This interaction clearly addresses the uncertainty Jung himself was experiencing at the time. The shepherd lived far removed from civilization, and Jung asks him whether the shepherd does not mind his primitive way of living and whether he does not miss civilization and culture. The shepherd indicates that he does not miss anything despite the hardness of living a rather primitive life. He does not miss anything because his life provides him with more than enough meaning, resulting exactly from his harshness. Jung questions, however, whether the shepherd would not be able to live a better, more fulfilling life within society, because only then will he be able to fulfill his true potential. The shepherd, however, does not agree, and indicates that he enjoys his free life in nature. You might be right, but this wonderful free life, one can't let it go. Life in the cities means deformity. According to the shepherd, his life in society would not add any value anyway, and he would only be one among many, one more or less in civilization. What difference does the individual make? The shepherd even argues that if people would be more courageous and would pursue what they really wanted, then more people would live like him. How many coward and weakling do you have among your culture laborer who participate only because of their cowardice and weakness, but at heart would like to do something else, if their anxiety would permit them? The Safford indicates that one of the biggest advantages of his way of life is that he can complete something, that there are not unlimited tasks and opportunities which one fulfilled culminate in only more tasks and opportunities are returned back to the finite, back to the limited human life, where the task and the life burn out together. I threw off impossible and came back to the possible. Jung was essentially living a similar life as the Safford. Jung was mentally living far removed from society, but was thereby, at least initially, limiting his potential within the real world, which resulted in a lot of uncertainty for Jung. This was the case because he could not in advance know whether his sacrifice had any value. The Safford, however, appeared to have encouraged Jung that he had chosen the right path. The shadow. Throughout the fifth volume of Black Books, we can clearly observe why Jung himself also concluded that all his most important ideas had their source within this exploration set out in the Black Books. Throughout most of the fifth volume of the Black Books, Jung is presented with the darker side of own personality through conversation with his unconscious. Jung is, for example, criticized for his selfishness. You gloatingly leave others in the lurk. If they only get caught in your snares, you exploit their naivety in order to present yourself wiser and superior. It is pointed out to Jung by interacting with the unconscious that he often pretends to be modest only with the hope of being praised for his modesty. At the same time, Jung is confronted with the idea that he hopes someone else will comment on his excellence. However, if this does not happen, then he remains dissatisfied. You play at modesty and do not mention your merit in the certain hope that someone else will do it for you. You are disappointed and withdraw, hurt, if this does not happen. Moreover, Jung's unconscious confronts him with the fact that although Jung finds it important to stay calm and does anything in order to appear calm, his calmness is merely an act. You preach hypocritical composure, but then it really matters. Are you calm? No, you are not. Pathetic liar. Jung managed to appear calm by keeping his anger within. You consume yourself in inner rage. Your tongue speaks cold dagger. Your eyes flash with hatred. Jung's unconscious indicates to Jung that Jung is using his acts to avoid doing what he really must do. These observations can, of course, be quite confrontational. However, from these confrontations, Jung came to believe in the idea of the shadow. When one explores one's own unconscious, according to Jung, one will inevitably be confronted by one's own shadow. This shadow is always present, but the individual attempts to hide it from the world because it consists of the darker, less desirable aspects of the individual character. Later, in the archetypes of collective unconscious, Jung would define the idea of the shadow more thoroughly, an idea which source can be found in the fifth volume of the Black Books, as discussed in chapter 3. According to Jung, if one looks deep within oneself, one will come across one's shadow. The true face will then be revealed, and the individual is confronted with the fact that his or her persona was used to cover up certain aspects of the self. Jung believed that this was the first taste, the taste which is a part of the exploration of unconscious, and for some the confrontation with the shadow would be so frightening that further exploration would become impossible. This confrontation is the first taste of courage on the inner way, the taste sufficient to frighten off most people. However, as long as one avoids his confrontation, the individual might project his or her own shadow upon others, and the world is in general, for the meeting with ourselves belong to the more unpleasant things can be avoided as long as one can project anything negative into the environment. This is also why Jung would later argue in his book Ayin that the world could become a victim of the conflict that is not resolved within the individual. However, if we are capable to see our shadow and are able to accept this darker side of our own personality, we become aware of our personal unconscious. We can thereby benefit from this inner harmony. It is extremely interesting to see by reading the black books. Now Jung come to realization of the existence of the shadow. As we can see in the 5th volume of the black books, Jung learned about the idea of shadow through the exploration of his own unconscious. This is also why the editor, Sonu Samdasani, wrote in the introductory volume that Jung believed that the ideas which he was uncovering did not apply just to himself, but were psychological characteristics common to all. The pleroma, uniting opposites. Up until this point, everything discussed within the black books can be characterized by the exploration of opposite unconsciousness and consciousness, darkness and light, good and evil, etc. Throughout the final parts of the black books, Jung is though the exploration of his own unconscious world, attempting to unite this opposite. In this regard, the idea of the pleroma is important as overarching principle. As you will see, however, the idea of pleroma is not introduced in order to attempt to reduce the difference between the opposite and opposite. Instead, unification can be achieved through further differentiation. The idea of pleroma is a Christian concept. However, when Jung refers to the pleroma, he refers to the definition of the Gnostics. Translated literally, the term pleroma means fullness. Jung elaborated on this definition of pleroma provided by Gnostics. Jung elaborated on this definition of pleroma provided by the Gnostics in the way that Jung defined the term. I believed that the pleroma can be seen as the supreme essence of everything that is, has ever been, and will ever be. As soon as an object of organism comes into existence, it is, however, differentiated from the pleroma because it will have developed an identity which the pleroma has not. That which is endless and eternal has no qualities, since it has all qualities. We call this nothingness or fullness, the pleroma. Therein both thinking and being cease, since the eternal and endless possesses no qualities. No one is in it, for he would then be distinct from the pleroma and would possess qualities that would distinguish him as something distinct from the pleroma. Since the pleroma is either everything or nothing, it does not possess any unique distinguishable characteristics. It cannot be differentiated. Depending on how one believes that the universe has been created, one might be able to compare the pleroma to God. Mother Nature, or any other creating entity. However, as Jung indicated, defining the pleroma is impossible simply because it is anything, everything, but also nothing. In the pleroma, there is nothing and everything. It is fruitless to think about pleroma, for this would mean self-dissolution. At the same time, however, Jung indicated that we are ultimately connected to pleroma. However, since we are also distinct from the pleroma, there is no way for anyone to change the pleroma. But we are the pleroma, for we are enclosed in the part of the eternal and the endless, but we have to share therein as we definitely removed from the pleroma, not spatially or temporarily, but essentially, since we are distinguished from the pleroma in our essence as creation, which is confined within time and space. What is the use of the pleroma? As a result, one might wonder why the idea of pleroma can be useful at all, since it cannot be properly defined. However, it is exactly because it cannot be defined that it is a useful term. Jung argued that because we are a part of pleroma, although we are infinitely removed from it, the pleroma is also a part of us. We are also the pleroma itself. Hence, I say that we are not in the pleroma, but we are it. Figuratively, the pleroma is the smallest point in us and the boundless firmament about us. In this way, the term can be used to indicate how everything past, present, and future is connected to each other. Everything exists as part of the pleroma. However, Jung came with an extremely interesting explanation as to why the idea of pleroma is important. According to Jung, creature exists because it can be differentiated. He or she can differentiate him or herself from other object and organism, and therefore he or she is. Since we, from the state of being, cannot define the pleroma, we, through our differentiation, exist. Jung attached great value to this differentiation. He argued that we, if we do not differentiate, cease to be. If we do not differentiate, we move beyond our essence, beyond creation, and we fall into a non-differentiation. We fall into the pleroma itself and cease to be created being. We lapse into dissolution in eternity and endlessness. This is the death of the creature. Therefore, we die. If we do not differentiate, we move beyond our essence, beyond creation, and we fall into non-differentiation. We fall into the pleroma itself and cease to be created being. We lapse into dissolution in eternity and endlessness. This is the death of the creature. Therefore, we die to the same extent that we do not differentiate. Hence, the creature's essence strives towards differentiation. This is called the principium individuationis. The spell of the pleroma. As you can see, the idea of the pleroma is quite complicated. However, after this initial discussion on the definition or the lack of a definition of the pleroma, we can see how Jung attempted to apply this term in a more practical sense. Jung observed that the pleroma consists of many pairs of opposites, good and evil, dead and alive, beauty and ugliness, etc. As indicated, Jung explored many of these opposites throughout the Black Books. However, in light of the idea of the pleroma, Jung explained that as soon as one attempts to pursue either one of these opposite, good for example, one falls prey to the spell of pleroma because the good cannot be without its opposite, evil. When we strive for the good or the beautiful, we forget our essence, which in differentiation, and we fall subject to the spell of qualities of the pleroma, which are the pairs of opposite. We endeavor to attain the good and the beautiful, yet at the same time, we also seize the evil and the ugly. Since in the pleroma, these are one with the good and the beautiful. If we, however, remain true to our own essence and do not fall prey to the pleroma, we can move beyond this pairs of opposite, according to Jung. Thereby, we distinguish ourselves from what is good and beautiful, but therefore also from what is ugly and evil. As a result, we are not subject to the spell of the pleroma. I believe that a lot of Jung's work is dedicated to this idea of differentiation, the principium of individuationist, the way in which one is differentiated from others. Jung believed it to be extremely important to pursue the true essence within oneself, essentially before one attempts to define the qualities of the world. At bottom, therefore, there is only one striving, namely the striving for the essence in you. If you had this striving, you would not need to know anything about the pleroma and its qualities, and yet you would attain the right goal by virtue of your own essence. Since, however, thought alienates us from our essence, I must teach you that knowledge with which you can bridle your thoughts. In simpler terms, the pleroma can be used to explain why is it important to pursue who one really is. If one does not do so, one can fall under the spell of the pleroma and therefore cease to be, because one can no longer differentiate oneself from everything or nothing. Self-overcoming. Jung brings all the ideas discussed so far to a conclusion in the seventh, the last volume of the Black Books. Throughout the Black Books, Jung discussed several extremely interesting ideas relating to, for essence, the unconscious, the shadow, finally to the idea of pleroma. Jung tried to find one who he really was and how he should be. However, in the end, he concluded that he can never be perfect and will always make mistakes. As Jung observed, these imperfections are also part of who he is. He continues to err. His errancy is his truth. He would do well to know it. Through errancy he lives. This is an important lesson which Jung earned from the confrontation, which is unconscious. Moreover, besides seeing one's errors as an integral part of one's identity and mentioned previous embracing one's own values, Jung come to conclusion that one should strive for one's fortune. Jung observed that we often attempt to feel good by acquiring the love of another. However, Jung indicated that it would be better if we can pursue the gifts inherent to ourselves. Isn't it better if it works on his own, doing what does him good, rather than desiring his well-being from his brother? Strive for the riches in yourself, and every good fortune that you need will happen to you. Jung suggests a certain solitude for this purpose. For Jung, this solitude was eventually characterized by, after having long and intense interactions with his unconscious, a break from his intense connection with his soul. My soul, should I call you? No, no more hope, no illusion. The terror must be naked, just as helpless as I. This time there are no crutches. We now plunge the rod into the bottomless behind all possibilities. Jung feared this solitude but equally embraced it. These developments represent the essence of all journey which Jung documented in the Black Books. First, one must get to know all the aspects of its own unconscious which might have been neglected for a long time. One must face and build a connection with one's unconscious, but also challenge it. In the end, however, one must accept all that with one encounters and move out into the world. I believe that for Jung, this meant that one could move into the world as a true individual, an individual who has his or her own values and interests and can differentiate him or herself enough from other in order to fall for the spell of the pleroma. This differentiation is possible because all of self-knowledge one has gained through the exploration of the unconscious.